Good evening and welcome to the Fruits of Our Writing Group Book Tour 2023. The Marshall Area Fine Arts Council is very happy we could be a part of this event, and we extend a special thank you to the Marshall-Lyon County Library for helping to make this evening possible. Now, as I thought about the introduction to the three authors here tonight, I kept going back to the idea of connections. How did it come to be that we're all here together this evening? It seemed to me to be connections, a chain or a link from one person to another that eventually made tonight happen. So how did three people, starting back in 2008, getting together at a coffee shop to share and respond to each other's writing, to offer crucial and critical support, result in a gathering at the Marshall Library? It was connections. We even might be having a small college reunion happening this evening. You never know. Now for us here in Marshall, our connection is Mary Ann Zarzana, formerly of Marshall, now living in South Bend, Indiana. Mary Ann has been friends and a sister in writing with Amber, Christine, and Mary for years. And when Mary Ann heard about the book tour, she suggested contacting MAFAC. And they did. Amber sent an email. Kathy forwarded the email to Deb and me. I contacted Paula, asking if the date would work for the library schedule. Our 3rd Street is torn apart right now, so it did not seem like a good idea to use MAFAC as the venue. And it's a really good thing because they started to pour the cement for the sidewalks today. You literally cannot get to MAFAC right now. Now, you know you live in a small town when you can organize and formalize a book tour reading in 2 days. Paula and Emily Rose designed and created the posters in 1 day, sending them out electronically. The posters were shared. The publicity got underway. It's really amazing, but that's what connections can do. Amber Jensen's The Smoke of You explores the challenges the author and her family faced during and after her husband Blake's deployment to Iraq. It's a story of selfless love and self-discovery, hardship and hope that will resonate with those who have suffered and those who have loved. Amber is currently a senior lecturer in the School of English and Interdisciplinary Studies at South Dakota State University, teaching courses in composition, literature, and technical and creative writing. Christine Stewart Nunez served as South Dakota's Poet Laureate from 2019 through 2021, and now teaches in the Women's and Gender Studies program at the University of Manitoba. Christine's Blue Words Greening was the winner of the 2018 Whirling Prize for Literature of Disability theme. Chrysopia Essays of Language, Love, and Place, The Alchemies of Ways We Associate, Complicate, Think Through, and Make Meaning. This collection of essays will take us from Istanbul to Iowa, pie making to family secrets. And Mary Wusterhaug is the author of Out of Loneliness, Murder and Memoir, and Daughters of the Grasslands. Out of Loneliness will take us to a small South Dakota town in 1962. I especially liked how the bio sheet said, Out of Loneliness braids the author's life with another's life. I liked that. Mary is Professor Emerita in the English department at SDSU and makes her home in Minneapolis. So please give our guests a warm welcome as we enjoy the fruits of their writing, Book Tour 2023.
This is Christine, and I am going to mess with the microphone a little bit before I get it right. Okay. So I elected to go first because I was kind of my idea to do this book tour, and so thankful for the connections made because it's very difficult to get a schedule together with 3 people with 3 different types of family obligations and work schedules, etc. But we started in Lincoln, Nebraska last week, and tomorrow we'll end in Watertown, South Dakota, before we will scatter and start trying to meet again on Zoom for our group meetings. So, like the introduction said, my book is Christpia in Essays of Language, Love, and Place. It is different than the other two books because it is essays that are very poetic in nature or lyric in nature. So they don't connect with each other with characters or with narrative, but with themes and images. So a lot of the essays are focused on language and learning language and unlearning language and finding new language, the lyric language of poetry. They're also focused on love, loosely, mostly family and parenting, but also for me as a parent, but also there are essays about my grandparents and my family, my mom and dad in here, mostly that take up issues of family secrets and family legacies and all sorts of things like that. I always say that these essays are less about the people and the places and more about the themes that connect them. So even though I say essays of language, love, and place, each piece gets more specific about that. So I was also talking about the title a little bit earlier. Christpia is a Greek term. It's an alchemic term for the transmutation of base metals into gold. And when I was looking to put these essays together, I was trying to find a way that I could pull them they would gel. Since, like I said, they don't have the kind of narrative that these other memoirs have. And what it came to is that in all of these essays, what my process is to take everyday experiences or insights and to try to create the art from them, to transmute these base metals into some kind of gold. And so that's where it came up. And I didn't know how to pronounce it when I saw the word, so I had to look it up. And my friends tease me because that seems to happen with other of my other books, like Blue Word Screening. What's a blue word? I made it up. So I typically either invent words or find ones that aren't very common, but they always have some particular meaning for my books. So I thought I would read for you a new, it's not new, but it's a piece I haven't read on this tour yet. One of the things we decided to do for each other was to pick different parts from our books because we've all seen these in draft form and maybe read the final drafts too, but we would want to entertain each other as we are entertaining folks that come to our reading. So this piece is called A Study of Nuns, Light, and Love. Nuns. The presence of nuns in my life is mysterious, and my persistent interest in them is baffling. My life began, so says my mother, because of a nun's prayer. Between my sister's birth and mine 9 years later, a Catholic nun, a close friend of my grandparents, coaxed my soul into my mother's womb. The nun's prayers and my mother's love coalesced, and voila, light in the dark space of her womb. I have no memory of this woman who claimed me as half hers, but my mother raised me with the knowledge of mystical parentage nonetheless. As a first grader, I sat by Sister Monica Mary at Mass and mimicked the way she folded her hands in prayer. I tried to concentrate, but the stained glass windows glowed like slabs of translucent candy. When the priest transformed a piece of bread into the body of Christ, a soft light sparked inside of me. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, the sun had shifted. My classmates knelt beneath a rainbow's end. The day after first grade ended, Sister Monica Mary and I ate sandwiches in her convent's kitchen. She gave me a mobile of spoon-sized fish woven out of pastel ribbons as if a goodbye gift. Suspended on nylon thread from a delicate metal arc, each fish sported a plastic eye. On mornings when light bent its way around the catkins on the pussy willow tree outside my bedroom window, it filled the hollow spaces at the core of each fish and made them buoyant. The fish swam in a sea of sunshine. Among my childhood collection of stuffed animals and Barbies were 2 nun dolls made by Sister Pacifica, my maternal grandmother's aunt. Nay, Beatrice McNaney, Sister Pacifica was born in 1895, entered the Orders of Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary at 19, and taught primary school in Chicago and Montana until she died at 35. The dolls' habits were starched and dusty, and I loved to roll the tiny beads of their rosaries between my index finger and thumb. As I stroked their porcelain cheeks, I wondered how she made them and why. In my mid-20s, my friend Melaine taught me the practice of guided meditation to manage stress. Close your eyes, she said. I welcomed the temporary surrender of the sunshine streaming through my apartment windows. Imagine that you are walking on a forest path. Very little sunlight makes its way through the trees. I relaxed, imagining the branches, the brush along the path, and a clearing with a boulder in its center. I sat on the rock. Then, without prompting, I had a visitation. A woman in a hooded cloak the color of blue asters approached me. When I asked to see her face, she said, "You're not ready." My eyes snapped open. "Who's the nun in your life?" Melaine asked. "I kept seeing her watching over you as you meditated." 8 years later, I visited Italy with my mother, a devout Catholic. I booked rooms at convents hoping to meet a nun who spoke English so I could strike up a conversation. Our room in Rome was so clean my sandals squeaked on the tiles and my fingertips, searching out the bathroom light, returned to me free of dust. The nuns had been there, scrubbing every inch, which comforted me when nausea sent me racing to the bathroom, my pregnancy with my first son at 8 weeks. Nuns cleared and cleaned and cooked and disappeared. As if refracted light through a stained glass window, they left traces of their care, not words. Light. Mysteries resist explanation, but they invite obsession. A nun praying me into existence, the fishmobile making me feel buoyant, meeting a nun during meditation that my friend perceived as well. Mystery doesn't conform to the ways I usually understand, but sometimes, if approached obliquely, I make discoveries. The light in the imagined womb, the stained glass windows, woven fish dangling in the sunrise, low light in the forest, and the clean light of Rome, in all of these images, the element of light suggests itself as a way of understanding. As a child, I knew these sources of light: candle, fireplace, light bulb, sun. The candles at church, tall Paschal candles, Advent candles, the stubbly red candle at the center of a Christmas wreath, the rows of short flames near the baptismal font. Reading books by the fireplace in the home where I grew up, I occasionally stared into the glowing pieces of orange wood, white ash falling off. To change a light bulb, I imitated my mother, rocking the loosened one back and forth to see if it was burnt out or just screwed in wrong. Eating breakfast in the kitchen, I watched the sun as it appeared on the roofs of our neighborhood's houses, and I studied the sun's outline on the pages of my science book, a yellow splotch with a bracelet of planets on the wrist of the Milky Way. I recall learning something about light traveling as a wave, about travel between planets taking light years. I imagined that light moved on lengths of clipped yellow yarn, a magic carpet of sorts, invisible to my eye. Now I see the same yellow yarn in my son's blanket. It's the same hue as the floss he used for the counted cross-stitch he tried before seizures began to disrupt his sleep and his focus. The presence of nuns feels like light, illuminating, powerful, mysterious. And yet I wonder about that metaphor. Light is a physical phenomenon. Scientists have explained its mystery, its behavior as both a wave and a particle. In 1801, Thomas Young passed sunlight through a pinhole with 2 slits. When they hit the film on the other side, the wave nature of light caused interference, resulting in bright and dark bands on the film. The pinhole test confirmed conventional wisdom. light behaves as a continuous wave. And yet 100 years later, Albert Einstein proposed an alternative way for light to behave, as a particle, a photon, because he knew that electrons are dislodged if light reached or exceeded a threshold frequency. And so, I experiment. I direct light through the pinholes of my observation, and what shines forth in the blurred spaces between? Love. Then, as if some threshold has been reached, as if an electron ejected from some mechanism in my brain, I see how light vibrates with love. Love. I understand love conventionally, its wave-like dimension clear. I felt the hormone-induced love for my son, Holden, when he was born, how logical it felt to love that little moon-faced being, flesh of my flesh. I parented him on a scale I knew, one I could sense, teaching, playing, tending. Holden liked to explore cause and effect at preschool, so we donned lab coats and conducted experiments with baking soda, water, and vinegar. He enjoyed dumping sugar into bowls, so we mixed cut-out dough, baked the cookies, and decorated them with yellow and red sugar sprinkles. He wanted to practice his letters, so we made homemade valentines for his preschool class with stamps and stickers, and he wrote their names himself. He got cranky in the late afternoons, so we relaxed on the couch listening to music. And then, when he was 4, Holden was diagnosed with an intractable epilepsy, and 2 years after that, Landau-Kleffner syndrome. His cognitive skills, especially his abilities to use and understand language, regressed, and the pervasive seizures left him chronically in a fog. Sometimes, during the sleep-deprived murkiness that made it tough for him to function, Holden hit or kicked me. Once, when he didn't want me to turn down the volume of his iPad, he hurled the charger at me, leaving a tiny welt on my back. With the onset of puberty, the fog lifted long enough for light to emerge. As the seizures abated, he learned to express his needs and thoughts with words. LKS taught me that my theory of love wasn't sufficient. It helped me discover its particle-like ways. I learned to ignore the moments when he shoved plates of French toast onto the floor. I learned to anticipate his needs, and when I failed, I learned to shepherd him to his room before the tantrum began. I learned to move in for a hug before Holden could hit me. None of these moves made sense conventionally, but love illuminated new paths for me to follow. Not long after I triangulated the nun's light love, I visited a historic church as a tourist. When I opened the heavy door, I gasped. Sunlight from clear paned windows drenched with the interior with brightness, and light bouncing off the ornate marble and metal altar. White walls culminated in a vaulted ceiling, and I caught my breath when I saw her, a habit-wearing nun in her mid-80s, kneeling at a wooden pew, hands folded in prayer. She barely moved, and I barely breathed. Nuns dedicated their lives to God. Put another way, they dedicated their lives to love. I wept silently. A nun had prayed me into existence. If this one here prayed for Holden, could her words accomplish with mystery? Sorry, Marianne, if you're watching this, we'll talk about it. If this one here prayed for Holden, could her words accomplish with mystery what my will and love could not? Although I've never stopped wishing for the impact of the seizures to disappear, my answer is no. And not because I've lost faith in mystery, but because the nun's light love helped me understand the ways that love powers and empowers me. As I'm revising with this essay for what feels like the last time, a former student, Katie, emails me with an invitation for tea. She'll be moving to California to reunite with her husband after finishing school and wants to say goodbye. We're settling in with cups of chai at the public library, a muted winter light bouncing off the snow outside, when Katie sips, puts down her mug, and looks directly at me. You know, I chose an unconventional path after high school. I sit forward in my chair, ready for a good story. I imagine Katie trekking through Mongolia, waiting tables in Las Vegas, or living an artist's life in Seattle. Instead, I was a nun for 8 years and lived in a cloistered life, first in Alabama and then in Arizona. Katie brushes her dark hair away from her eyes and reads the look of surprise on my face. I couldn't get over the serendipity of yet another nun, one I didn't even recognize the whole semester. Even though Katie often spoke in class, she rarely shared personal details. There was always a veil of mystery about her. But that seemed to be the pattern for me: nuns, light, and love, even when I least expect them, mystery and understanding commingling and yield a new way of loving. And when I, God, stop, it has to be the last night. I haven't done this yet. And when I received Katie's blessing before she left South Dakota, a loving prayer bound in words with the promise of light written on a handmade card and accompanied by a candle, I recognized how love empowers us. I wish you... Okay, I got it. Okay. No, I can't read it. Hold on. Okay. I wish you greatness in your art. I wish you greatness in your art and skill, joy and happiness in your family, and health for your blessing. The life of a son and a wonderful, and a wonderful impact of your love and his presence cultivate in our world. Okay, I gotta read that again because you could not hear that. Okay, so this is what she read. This is the end of the essay, by the way, so we'll be good after this. So so this is what she wrote. I wish you greatness in your art and skill, joy and happiness in your family, and health for your blessing, the life of a son and the wonderful impact your love and his presence cultivate in our world. Okay, I'm done. This is only going to Mary. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry.
That's good. You did wonderful.
Well, I haven't read that aloud before in front of people.
I hope you haven't started a trend. I thought Mary was going next, but then I thought when I was listening to Christine read, there are some intersections with what she just read and what I was planning to read. So my book, I'm Amber Jensen, and my book is The Smoke of You, a memoir of love during and after deployment. And so my husband was deployed to Iraq shortly after we were married. And so this idea of finding our ways to communicate, making sense of the challenges we were facing, finding inspiration and metaphors around us to help us make sense of things and get through those challenging times is definitely something that I was searching for when I was writing this book. And so I'm going to read just an early section. I'm going to read a couple of sections, but just to give you an idea. So like I said, Blake was deployed shortly after we were married, and this is the scene of when he told me he was going to be deployed. So we weren't yet married. We were planning our wedding when Blake called one night. I attempted the usual small talk, but he resisted. This wasn't unusual exactly. As comfortably as we'd settled into our relationship, Blake could still feel distance sometimes. Conversation didn't always come naturally. But this phone call was not stunted by an awkward silence. It was strained silence, broken finally with a rush of words. I can't drive down there tonight, he said, and I know I shouldn't tell you this over the phone, but it just can't wait. My response was slow, lilted. Okay. I froze by the kitchen table, steadied myself on a chair. His voice rumbled like radio static. Amber, my unit's being activated. Your what? I blinked at the words. My cell phone burned my cheek. What do you mean? My guard unit, he explained. I'm being deployed. The word rang in my ears as Blake added, to Iraq. I nodded involuntarily like a disruptive bobblehead doll. Deployed meant gone. To Iraq meant to war. Reality took shape. When? This summer, he whispered. And my stomach hollowed as if I'd just sped over a hill and the road dropped out from under me. I swayed. How long? 12 months? Tears filled my eyes as months became math equations, our life a story problem. If a soldier is deployed in July and his child is due in October, how old will the child be when his dad returns from a 12-month deployment? If his dad returns. My head bobbing shifted side to side as I studied my own naivete. How could I have forgotten this possibility? How could words like activation and deployment sneak up on me? The first traces of our love were letters mailed from South Dakota to Fort Sill, Oklahoma during basic training and AIT. Our first kiss came on the 4th of July under a cottonwood tree, and our relationship rekindled on Memorial Day weekend. I had rehearsed my role as Blake's something to come home to on drill weekends. I knew soldier was a significant part of his identity, but when I started to imagine him as husband and father, when I shifted my focus to the planning of a wedding and the picking of baby names, I'd forgotten about that part of the script until that moment when soldier became a defining characteristic, war an eminent reality. I don't remember how the rest of the conversation played out, but I'm sure Blake apologized, reassured. I'm sure I had little to say, not knowing what questions to ask. The news caught me off guard. Like I'd been walking on a sunny winter day, relishing in the warmth when I hit a patch of ice and felt my feet slip out from under me. The shift seemed dangerous. Broken wrist, concussive blow of head on sidewalk. But then I reoriented myself, reflexively lowering my center of gravity, curling myself into a protective stance. I fought off the overwhelming emotion with logic. Sometimes deployments dissolved, orders changed. Many assignments were safe, boring even, and all the soldiers I could think of in my family, in our community, had safely returned from war. So by the time Blake said, "I'm sorry, I know I shouldn't have told you over the phone, I just didn't think I could wait," I had recovered enough to deflect the apology. "It's okay," I said, "you needed to tell me." I knew his regret was sincere, even though I also knew he was probably relieved that he didn't have to look me in the eye when he told me the news or watch the words wash over me. If he'd come to tell me in person, he might have invited me to go for a drive. Let the highway serve as an excuse to avoid eye contact. But I knew he believed it when he promised, "Everything will be all right." So that was the beginning of that story. And so, just that idea of bracing ourselves for the challenges and figuring out how to get through this together was something that seemed to come more naturally to my husband, but maybe that's because he was the one expecting it, I'm not sure. But for me, writing was definitely a way of finding that strength and conjuring up memories of him when he was gone and ways of reaching out to him when he was gone. And so writing also connected me to find those sources of strength around me. And so I'm going to read another section that comes from a little bit later in the deployment. And at this time, Blake had been in Iraq. Our son was born in his first weeks of entering Iraq, so that actually he was still in his pre-deployment. They weren't in a war zone yet when I was in the hospital, and he told me we'd be traveling on the same day, which means he would be going to Baghdad the same day I would be going home with our son. And so he had let me know, all right, we're going to be traveling. You won't hear from me for a while. So at that point, this is me reflecting on that kind of beginning of the actual deployment experience. Our lives were veering in opposite directions. I knew our son in terms of the hot weight of his sleeping body. Blake knew him in terms of hands like catcher's mitts and a perfectly round head, the stories his family had told him. I settled into a routine of diaper changes and feedings and grew accustomed to interrupted sleep, Blake settled into a routine of night missions, daytime sleep, and weekly phone calls to me. Sometimes those conversations were easy, sprinkled with laughter. Other times awkward, fumbling, peppered with pauses. Sometimes when I described the marvel of George's eyes widening as he explored shadows and light, the way he worked his mouth into silent O's, Blake seemed to understand, or at least want to. Other times he seemed unprepared for my stories about the child he hadn't met, the joy he couldn't fully imagine. Sometimes he found things to say about life in Iraq, comments on food or climate, care packages he'd received, but more often he waited for me to talk. Less than 2 months into Blake's deployment, I was shopping when my phone trilled inside my purse. I dug it out and smiled as it flashed 0, unknown. I flipped my hair back, lifted the phone to my ear, and leaned into the shopping cart, picturing Blake in digital camo, leaning into a payphone. Anticipating the deep scratch of his voice, I answered with an intimate, "Hi." He must have responded, because I moved on to the usual, "How are you?" But then he hesitated. He exhaled into the phone. I drew the heavy pause into my lungs and panicked as my voice echoed back to me. Finally, Blake spoke. His words waited. "I'm okay," he said. "But something's happened. Some guys were hurt." Unable to absorb the impact of his words, to make sense of the questions swarming in my mind, I focused on insignificant details, steel beams glaring with fluorescent lights, a blue honeycomb cart. I searched for something to say, something appropriate to feel. "I'm so sorry, Blake, are you..." I couldn't finish the question. Of course he wasn't. He answered anyway. "I wasn't there on that mission. I'm fine. But it was bad." I stood between a bright waterfall of women's clothes and shelves lined with towels of blue, green, burgundy, and gold, folded neatly, stacked in 4s. I couldn't speak. Blake broke the silence. "I just wanted to call before you heard it somewhere else. I wanted you to know I was okay." "Of course," I fumbled for words. "Blake, I'm so sorry. I don't know what to say." "I know. There really isn't anything to say." George must have been snuggled in his car seat right there in front of me as I searched for something to say to the father he hadn't yet met, but I can't picture him there. I must have said something, but I can't remember what. I only remember my hollow throat, a feeling of emptiness filled suddenly with the thought of my Grandpa Dayton, and how Grandma always said he'd worried about becoming a father after having experienced war. Would Blake feel the same way? How couldn't he? I lingered on this question, avoiding the scream of a larger fear. What if Blake never got to be a father? My eyes followed dingy floor tiles, hoping they would lead me somewhere, backwards in time maybe, to a wedding dance where I could lean into Blake's warmth, listen to his off-key rendition of Desperado, or maybe forward to an airport embrace, to a moment when I could feel Blake's arms locked behind my back, his breath on my neck. Instead, my eyes crossed, blurring the grid of tile into a fuzzy, floating checkerboard. Eventually, Blake said, "Well, I really need to get off the phone. Other guys need to call home." I'm sure we said goodbye, but all I remember is numbness. I breathed and blinked as I lifted my eyes. My features felt bloated and heavy like they do after a deep sleep sometimes. My nose blurred my line of vision, lips felt fat and numb. My chin seemed to spill down over my neck. My fingers anchored me to the floor. I moved mechanically. And then I started to walk, letting the worn wheels of the cart pull me through the aisles. When I made it home, I lifted George from his car seat and paced the living room with him snuggled in my arms. What if that's our last call? And "I'm sorry" was all I could say. The question echoed like a voice from the hall, a memory of someone else's life. It was my Grandma Evie, her story of Grandpa Dayton's tragic death. Dayton had been working at home, announced a quick trip to town, just a few errands, home soon. She waved a quick goodbye, but when Dayton neared the train tracks a half mile south of their farm, where the cows had gotten out the day before, Grandma was sure he had squinted into the sun to check the fence line. When the train emerged from the grove of trees along the track, he was 30 feet away. He hit the brakes too late. Later, Grandma wondered, why didn't I go to him? Why didn't I kiss him goodbye? I'd always heard those words, those questions as a wish for one last connection, one last I love you. But after Blake's call, after feeling the threat of tragedy pulse through my body, I understood that she wanted more than a goodbye. If Grandma had stopped Dayton with a kiss, slowed him just a little bit, the train would have passed. Tragedy might have been avoided. She wanted to be the something that kept him alive. And I sat in my apartment staring at a photo of Blake, playing my own track of regret. What if this is the conversation I spend the rest of my life reliving? I willed myself to be the something that kept Blake alive, but I knew it wasn't in my power. And even though my wishing was something like a prayer, I couldn't pray for God to save Blake. I'd never believed in praying for specific outcomes. Not because I'd witnessed enough good people suffering terrible things to accept that life simply wasn't fair. I hadn't lived enough to learn that yet. But because it felt selfish. 2 soldiers from Blake's unit were already dead, 2 more hospitalized and fighting for their lives. I couldn't demand or even hope that my desires be prioritized. Prayer wasn't an act of control. It was an act of submission. I gave myself over to it. Refocusing my vision, I studied the image of Blake and I from our wedding day hanging on the wall just above my head. In the photo, my head tilts slightly, resting against his lapel. We both squint with serene smiles into sunlight. Behind us, pillowy white clouds dot a cornflower blue sky. Feeling connected somehow, I talked to Blake, tentatively at first, about how much I missed him, about how scared I was that I wouldn't get to see him again. And I apologized, and fear and regret gave way suddenly to the warmth of a story, a litany of memories, summer nights in the dugout sipping Old Mill Light, a shy marriage proposal, a friend bellied up to the shrimp cocktail bar at our wedding reception, until I arrived back at that moment, the uncertainty we faced. In the near darkness and complete silence of my living room, I reassured my husband. Blake, if you don't make it home, it will still be enough. Knowing that we were in love, that we were meant to be together, even if just for a little while, that George was meant to be, I grazed my fingertips over my collarbone. Don't feel bad if you don't make it. Some people never feel as loved in their whole lives as I have felt loved by you. So, So that's the beginning of the story, and I guess I'm out of my home state, so you guys don't know, spoiler alert, we're still married, happily have another child, but we have faced the challenges not only of the deployment, but the emotional and physical pain that comes with that. My husband has suffered depression and chronic pain and addiction to pain medication. And there are so many challenges that come, but there are also so many family stories, like the ones that I shared here that became part of our sense of how we could navigate this together and how we could find our way forward. And that's really the motivation for writing the book, is to hopefully, as the introduction said, connect with people who have experienced challenges, whether it be with deployment, any of those things, chronic pain, right? Just the challenges of daily life and married life, but finding that way forward. And I know that we talked about the fact that, we wished we had kind of had some of those stories of how to navigate the VA system and, some of those challenges. So this book is our attempt to share that story and, like I said, my attempt to process that and learn from it and keep moving forward. So thank you.
I'm Mary, the last and the oldest, right? By far. My book's a little bit different, although it was born out of a tragedy. it was not my tragedy. It was a tragedy I knew about in Chamberlain, South Dakota, where I grew up, or just west of the river, actually. But in some ways, it really, my father is a major theme throughout this book. And my father died when I was 22, which was, I never really grieved the way I needed to grieve. And then when I started working with this group, they sort of led me to understand you need to write some of these feelings out. And that was one of the things this book helped me do, is to really face, probably for the first time, some of the awful, painful moments of losing my father. The tragedy that I'm referring to is a murder that happened in Chamberlain, South Dakota on Memorial Day 1962 when I was 16 years old. The murderer was a 24-year-old laundry worker named Bev Waugh, who dressed very much as a masculine, as a man. She wore cowboy shirt, boots, jeans. She had her hair cut in the kind of duck style. We called it a duck ass, excuse me, but we called it a duck ass, right? Greased back over her ears. And she murdered a 21-year-old Native American man named Myron Menzie, who was engaged to Jeannie, a 19-year-old, who lived in Puckwana, which is 8 miles east of Chamberlain. Bev was in love with Jeannie. So it was a complicated relationship, obviously. So on that Memorial Day, Bev came around the corner and rammed on Sanborn Street and rammed Myron's car into the curb. Eventually she got out, she went over, she opened the door, and after a couple of words, she put a .22 to his chest and pulled the trigger. Obviously you don't forget that, right? But I hadn't thought about it much after everything settled down, and there was a second trial in which she was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and that's kind of a complicated story too. But after that, I just sort of moved on, forgot about it. While I was cleaning out my mother's house in Chamberlain in 1999, and tucked in her sheet music was a front page picture on the Mitchell Daily Republic of Bev Waugh. And I was stunned when I saw the picture, because my image that I'd held for 50 years, I guess 50 years, was of a brawny, fierce, middle-aged man, tomboy is the word I would have had for her, who was very frightening to me because she was just so odd, so different. She was tiny. She had little features. I remember the picture, her delicate little ears. She wore a size 6 cowboy boot. She was tiny. And on the way home, I kept thinking, how could I have been so wrong about that? And if I was so wrong about her physical appearance, what else was I wrong about? What didn't I know at the time? And I didn't get back to this story for another 12 years or so, but it was always there. It was always there. Why didn't I understand this better? So I went to the Brule County Courthouse and got the trial transcript, and actually got the transcript for the appeal as well. I interviewed people. I did a lot of true crime memoir reading, and I would say that the transcript was by far the most useful piece of information I got. Included in the transcript were letters that the two women had written to one another, and that was public information. So I really was able to hear this story through the words of, up to the point of the murder, through the words of these two main players. One of the things I wanted to do was to figure out how was Bev and I, how were we alike and how were we different? And, it begins with family. Bev was, the night of the murder, when they took her to, I guess it was a couple days later, they took her to the state hospital to do evaluation. Her IQ was 72. A few weeks later, they measured it again, and it had gone up to the low 80s. She was an 8th grade dropout. She was an outsider, obviously, physically, the way she looked. Her family struggled with poverty, alcoholism, depression, mental illness. They lived in this rundown house in a grove of dark trees in a dark spot by the Missouri River, down along one of the bays of the Missouri River. I certainly didn't grow up wealthy, but I grew up very middle class. My parents were provided as stable a home as any parents. I mean, we weren't perfect, but it was a very stable home for the most part. They encouraged and helped us get college educations. I was white, and I was a girl. And I thought, boy, you had it all. You didn't know it, but compared to Bev, you had it all. And that was one of the things I do throughout this book, is try to make Bev not a caricature or an evil person. She did an evil thing, but I don't think at heart she was an evil person. And that sometimes is hard to grasp, that you can do something evil but not be an evil person. And I really feel she wasn't. This is what it happens, but this is the first trial. It happened in September of 1962. And Nemachamelin is a town of 2,000 in the middle of central South Dakota, just on the east side of the river, but because the land where I grew up was on the west side of the river, and if you don't know that that's a big difference, you haven't lived in South Dakota, okay? But to this day, I'm a West River girl. That's what I tell people. Even though the house in Chamberlain was east of the river, the farm ranch operation was west, and that's where I identify. September 24th, 1962. Imagine the flurry of activity in a small town on the opening day of a murder trial. Farmers took baths in the morning. The corn isn't quite dry enough to pick, so I won't be going to the fields today. Might as well go to the trial, they told their wives, looking in mirrors as they shaved, sheepish expressions on their faces. Mothers packed lunch buckets with thermoses of chicken noodle soup and peanut butter sandwiches, avoiding their children's questions as they hustled them out the door. Why did that woman kill that man? They dashed down the street to the supermarket to buy slices of bologna and loaves of bread, maybe a package of Lorna Doones or Oreo cookies, plucked tomatoes off the vines in their gardens, sliced cucumbers in bowls of vinegar, and left the breakfast dishes in the sink. They planned to spend the day in the courtroom if they could get in, so supper would be light that night. Business owners juggled schedules to allow employees chunks of time to attend the hearing. Those employees scurried down the sidewalk to the courthouse, a few blocks south of Maine. Each person returned with a different story. A clerk from the hardware store claimed she was standing on the corner when the Davison County Sheriff drove his squad car into town with Bev handcuffed in the back seat. Bev looked helpless behind the mesh screen that trapped her. Still, the clerk said she felt a chill when Bev turned to stare at her as the car drove by. She kept looking at me with those dark, dark eyes. A waitress at the Hilltop Cafe spotted a caravan of cars driven by newspaper reporters with press badges on cords around their necks. The banker noticed the Lincoln County license plate on the car and knew the driver was Samuel Maston, her defense attorney. Was the first day of the trial as beautiful as I remember, sunny with hint of gold in the cottonwood trees and a faint chill on bare skin, a season when the air smells of autumn and of burning leaves? Or was it hot and muggy, a day when the oppressive air zaps the energy out of living things and children trudge to school quiet and sluggish? Sparrows and mice take refuge in the shade of cottonwood trees, and the lawyers pack extra handkerchiefs to wipe away the sweat that collects on their brows. On my way to school that morning, I drove by the courthouse where people gathered on the lawn. Samuel Maston, her defense attorney, pushed through the crowd, a briefcase in his hand, a folded newspaper under his arm. He was tall and lanky, his arms long and thin. His navy sports coat jacket hung loosely from his narrow shoulders. His white shirt was starched and pressed, and gold cufflinks gleamed in the cuffs. With blonde hair cut in a buzz and youthful skin, he looked wholesome and bright, a high school basketball player or debate champion, and far too young for the task ahead of him. But when a seam in the crowd opened, he walked confidently through it. During the trial, he would address the complaints of some in the community that he, an outsider, had come to defend Bev for the money or to enhance his reputation. There must have been some comments about myself which are a matter of indifference to me, he said. On occasion, we make considerable money. On occasion, we don't. Generally, public defenders are not paid much, but they take the case anyway. Attorneys do not refuse when a judge asks them to represent a client. Women in printed house dresses swayed in the muscle memory motion of mothers soothing their babies. Ruddy-faced men in plaid shirts and dark jeans held Stetsons in their calloused fingers. They studied the ground when they spoke. High school girls giggled and tugged at their skirts. Some took pictures with their brownie cameras, flash bulbs popping and chemicals storing images on silver crystals of film, the way memories were being embedded in the hippocampus of their brains. A few boys clumped together, jostling with the hungry energy of baby chicks around a feeder. The senior boys mostly slouched against their cars, pretending to be bored, but unable to conceal the nervousness by shuffling their feet against the grass. In a town that often seemed dull, the trial was homecoming, the rodeo, and the carnival wrapped up into 1 week. The excitement in the crowd made my stomach swoop with the memory of the night my father and I strolled on a carnival midway. We came upon a tent with posters advertising the freak shows, the pygmy and the giant, the fat lady and the midget. One poster showed photographs of the wild boy from Borneo crouched in the corner of a cage. He wore a tiger-striped fur and his hair was ragged and dirty. He extended his hands or claws toward me, his eyes narrowed like a cat ready to pounce. Looking at him, I felt the same flop in my stomach, the same rapid heartbeat I felt on the tilt-a-whirl and the roller coaster. This boy with his unruly hair and yellow eyes terrified me. But it was his very frightening, freakish nature that made me desperate to see him, in the same way I couldn't resist the carnival rides. "Oh, please, Dad, can we go see the wild boy, please?" He shook his head. "Paying money to stare at unfortunate people is cruel, Toots. That's not how good people behave. Now, how about I buy you some cotton candy instead?" I pulled on the sticky threads as we strolled past the merry-go-round and the Ferris wheel. I felt accosted and nauseous from the jumble of senses, flashes of neon lighting the sky, barkers calling us to shooting booths, their voice rising above the squeak of swings on the Charo plains, the discordant melody of the calliope screeching beneath the clanking of wheels as the roller coaster ascended the steep tracks. My father talked to me about riding the rails with the hobos to the Chicago World's Fair. I slept in a flophouse, Toots, along with the bums. The next couple days, I toured all the exhibits. It was all so fun and exciting for a farm boy. He had told me that story before, so I thought he was distracting me from my disappointment over missing the wild boar. But the sideshows that year, I did some research on that, the sideshows that year included 2 Filipino men described as dog-eating missing lynx and the live 2-headed baby, in reality conjoined infants preserved in formaldehyde. Perhaps my curious father had memories, shameful memories, of buying a ticket and walking past the freaks, trapped in their grotesque shapes like ammonite in Badlands shale. Did those who stand in line to grab a seat at Bev's trial come with the same flutter in their stomachs as those who walked past the wild boy or the missing lynx? Would the photos of a splotch of blood on Myron's shirt or the details of sex cause a spike of dopamine in the brains of the spectators as the carnival rides did? Or did some leave the trial feeling dirty and sick to their stomach, as my father may have in Chicago? Did they too leave with compassion for others' suffering? Nobody under the age of 18 could attend the trial without permission from their parents, so all the kids clutched slips of white paper. I didn't ask my parents for permission. Rumors spread that the trial would reveal saucy, my mother's word for details of sex. Growing up Catholic, I was surrounded by pregnant women, but my mother was tight-lipped about those bulging bellies, even her own. When I was 5 years old and she came home with my baby brother, I asked her where he came from. "Don't worry about that, he's here, isn't he?" I pictured someone delivering Kevin the way Santa Claus crept into the house and tucked presents under the Christmas tree. As for my father, he probably saw this trial as a carnival sideshow that only cruel people would attend. So unless my parents woke up one morning in a freakish transformation of their characters, they would never agree to sign such a slip. When the doors to the courthouse opened, people prodded and shuffled like cattle in chutes up the stairs and into the courtroom. I had never been in a courtroom, but as a teenager, my little brother Kevin went to court very often, mostly for curfew violations. The last time he appeared in this room, he had been caught bagging more than his limit of pheasants. Kevin stood below the raised platform where the judge swiveled in his enormous black chair, looking over his glasses at a teenage boy, trembling and sputtering apologies. Finally, the game warden said, "He's not a bad kid, Your Honor, he's just damn stupid." Kevin escaped with a stern warning from the judge. "I don't want to see you in here again." In the 1960s, going to court was something like being sent to the principal's office for a lecture on detention. People stopped for speeding, public intoxication, or drunken driving often left the courtroom with only a fine and a stern warning. Our neighbors from the nearby reservations, however, were routinely tossed in jail for the same crime. They remained there until family and friends could raise bail, often set higher for them than most folks. The lady with the scales was not always blindfolded when justice was dispensed for Native Americans in our state. But I didn't wonder why that might be so. I just accepted that drunkenness was different for white people than it was for Native people. Years later, my brother Terry admitted himself into a treatment program for alcohol dependency. I then understood that while I mindlessly accepted discrimination against one people, alcohol didn't. And one of the reasons I wanted to read that last part is another thing I weave into this is the story of Native Americans. We lived right between two reservations, really, the Laurel Brew and the Crow Creek. So we were neighbors. And my father was very good friends with a native man, hunted with him, and they farmed together, helped each other out. But I was just clueless about all of this. And, you know, really, I grew up in a very racist community, but I didn't think I was a racist because I didn't use the words. And so in the process of all this, you know, you learn over the years what that means, you know, how racism really affects you and you think it doesn't. And I wanted to draw, since Myron was Native, I wanted to draw into some of the Native American issues as well, because we can assume that that too played into how the community viewed this murder. That had Myron been white, there might have been a different outcry against the murder rather than as a Native man. So those are the stories I braid. And I learned a lot. I learned a whole lot about what it means to live outside what we consider normal society, when in fact it's much broader than we think it is. Thank you.
Are there any questions? I promise I won't cry.
There was a lot of weeping.
Yeah.
Our typewriter keys probably, computer keys probably rusted, right?
Yeah.
But we worked through some, the three of us, I was thinking about that on this trip, the three of us worked through some very painful stories.
But I was also thinking as we were reading, I swear there are funny parts in every one of these too, you guys. They're not just depressing, sad books.
Right, no, there's funny.
There's humor and hope too, but what was your question?
I was thinking, so you became known as the three women that would come to the coffee shop and cry?
Yeah.
You know, the employees look over at you, oh, they're at it again.
Probably.
The question I had for you, Amber, the title of your book, The Smoke of You.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, it's a wonderful title and I love it. It was not the title that I chose. They're words that I wrote, but a little bit, you know, Christine was talking about the challenges of titling. That I think that's the hardest part of writing is coming up with titles. And so I had a different title in mind, a couple, but my publisher was, when she said, okay, I believe in this book, I want to publish this book, but I'm not sure about the title. Let's keep an open mind. And, you know, so as editors were reading and we were working through the process of getting the book ready for publication, you know, nothing better was coming up. We couldn't make a decision. And then the final copy editor said, I know what the title is. It's The Smoke of You. And as soon as I read it, I went, yes, that is the title. So I wrote this phrase in a letter that I never sent to my husband. It was a day that, it was within a month of him returning. And so things had started to feel normal, except that we had started communicating less and less, and he had lost a closer friend towards the end of the deployment, and I could feel him almost further away as he was getting closer to home. And I was doing the same thing, right? And I realized later when someone read it that I was kind of experiencing survivor's guilt in my own way, right? Because I realized it was almost the end of the day and I hadn't thought of him, right? And I felt really guilty. And so I started the letter that said, Dear Blake, I almost forgot to miss you today. And then I couldn't finish it. And then I found that scrap of paper when we were writing. I found that letter that I had started, and then I finished it in the writing process. And so I tried in that moment to try to explain to Blake what that felt like and to apologize for it. And similar to the part that I read, you know, where I guess I did a lot of that. I talked to him when he wasn't there, right? But telling him that you're still always part of me. And so the phrase I wrote was, it makes me long to inhale the smoke of you. And, you know, to kind of wrap my arms around something intangible, right? To hold on to us or to hold on to our relationship. And so when she came back with that title, I was like, yeah, you nailed it. So like I said, they're my words. I just never thought of it as the title. And I was really thankful to have those, you know, someone else's eyes to pick that up.
Do you want to, each of you, tell us a little bit about your writing routine or process? Like, do you spend 3 hours a day? Do you have a set thing? How do you do it?
Usually I have a set amount of time that I try to, like, either I choose a time or a word count or another assignment. Like, oh, I'm gonna revise this chapter, part of this chapter, I'm gonna work on this scene. So I give myself some sort of assignment, and usually like a couple of hours to complete that assignment. So, or if it's a new project that I don't have something to revise and I'm gonna generate it, I'll say, oh, I'm gonna, sit here and free write till I get 500 words or I try to choose like a word count for that. Usually during usually I try to write or spend time like 10 to 15 hours a week, depending, or doing writing or writing adjacent things. So this is writing adjacent because it's for the writing, but it's not the actual writing. But I revise like a lot.
My process is, I think I'm less disciplined in some of those ways, but also, it goes in spurts for me. So right now, I'm just beginning to formulate the next projects, and so I more have kind of weekly writing goals right now, I think, because, and also my kids are teenagers and they keep me really busy, and so I'm running around a lot. My schedule is different every week, but I'm currently more in a kind of a weekly writing phase. But we are hopefully all starting new projects that we'll kind of get back to our old pace, because for me, I just need a deadline. If a self-imposed deadline is a little too flexible for me, and that's why this writing group has been so integral to keeping my writing going, is because it would be like, oh, we're going to meet on Thursday and we're supposed to send our stuff to each other by Tuesday, so I better get to work, right? So for me, I need deadlines too. So it varies just kind of at what stage you're at in the writing process as well. But that's where I'm at right now. How about you, Mary?
Well, I'm retired. So that changed for me. It made it much easier. And I've been to previous book, and in both books, I would go in, the office. I wasn't working. I'd go into my office. Our daughter was grown and married, and I would shut the door, and I'd take the phone in there, but I would only answer if my husband or my daughter called. If anybody else called, if their house wasn't on fire, but they could leave a message, my house is burning, and then I would call afterwards. But I just did not allow anything to interrupt me. And I might be in there 4 or 5 hours. I'm only coming out for a bathroom break. I write quickly but dreadfully. So I would get drafts down, but they always were horrible. All my drafts were first original drafts. All my 5th drafts were horrible. And I had so much trouble with structure. I could write a scene. I could work on a scene and sort of feel good about that. But then I would think, I don't know, I'm going to put this in the book. Because I didn't have an idea, so structuring took a lot of time. I revised like crazy, and so I would spend a lot of time revising. I do a lot of bubbling, or writing bubbles, and I might put the word Bev in the middle and then try to write a bunch of words about Bev that come to me as I thought about Bev, or as I wrote about the dad, I put dad in the circle and circled it. And then things about my dad I thought I might want to write about. That's how I brainstorm. And then from there, I would go to the computer. Mostly I write at the computer. Do you guys? Mostly. But I do write some sections by hand if I'm struggling a little bit. So I might write some things by hand. But I compose them.
And in these early stages, I'm more idea generating and messier writing, so that's more often by hand. And when I get down to the really, I have an idea and I'm trying to develop it, I almost always have to leave my house. Because if I'm in my house, I get distracted by things. So, I like to go, I might even just go sit out in the barn and take a lawn chair out there, but then I can concentrate because I'm in a different space, or go sit out in the trees or at a coffee shop. So for me, that always changes too.
Well, and if I went into throwing a load of laundry, I was struggling with the right. Otherwise, I didn't know.
I get a lot of chores done.
Yeah. Exactly.
Now, novels would outline and really know what the end of the thing is. Do you do that? Do you know what your book is going to say at the end?
You would think writing about my own life and writing a memoir that I would have, right? But the first draft of this book that I thought was a complete draft was really only treating the year of my husband's deployment. And I was writing about that experience, so some of the stuff that I read here. And then I realized by the time I thought I was finished with that, life had moved on and we were facing chronic pain and depression and realizing how difficult it was to navigate the VA system. And so then I started writing about that. And then by the time I thought that was finished, I was realizing, oh, we're still struggling to unlearn the communication patterns that we learned to get through deployment. And so it was challenging, but I think I had to do that, right? In my case, I'm really thankful that what I thought was the first complete draft of this book was never accepted by anyone or published, because it would have left out what I think is the most important part of the story, right?
Gotcha.
Which is the quiet part of the story, right? That we can, you know, even people in our community and even in our family would, you know, have read this book and said, oh, I didn't know how much there was underneath, right? And that's my whole motivation now for sharing this story, is that I think in order to really, you know, help each other, just as community members and family members, we need to understand each other's stories, but the veteran story, you know, that can be so quiet underneath, and we miss a lot of the challenges that people face. You know, so like I said, really thankful that although I didn't know that was part of the book in the beginning, that's where the writing of this book led me to process and think about and understand and share. So.
This is Christine, and I think that for me, if I outline, if I think I know, I'm dooming myself to absolute struggle, because it's only in the discovery of the writing process and discovering like what I'm thinking that I can actually make something. And if I'm not surprised by where something goes, then my reader's not going to be surprised by something goes. And someone famous actually said that, not me, but I'm forgetting who it was. So like I I have a sense of where I'm going. I could sketch that out, right, and have some like outline-ish or brainstorm-ish kinds of things. But in the end, it rarely looks like that, and I have to kind of track what meaning am I making from this, like what, you know, like it's always intuitive in some ways. Like I knew the nuns and the light metaphor and belonged in the same essay, but I was like, why? Like how can I do that? Like I just knew in my gut that these belong in the same. So it really was a exploration of how I was going to triangulate, and then the love idea came through, and that was this like triangulation. So I think for me, it's always like discovery in the process that really creates the better piece.
Well, you did very well, I thought.
I didn't know, this is Mary, I didn't know how this book would open and end. I guess I should say I did. I knew that the book would open with Bev, because old Highway 16, as we call it, used to bisect Chamberlain. You drive down a steep hill into Chamberlain, drive through the town, cross the Missouri River, and eventually go back up the bluffs. Well, that's what Bev had to do to commit the murder. She drove down the hill to Main Street, turn, and so forth. I knew I would open with her coming down the hill. I knew I would close with myself driving back up the hill to go back to Brookings, having finished the book, or maybe not finishing it, but having immersed myself in the book. So I knew it would open with her going down and me coming up. That's all I knew.
Yeah.
When you have a project in front of you, do you sit down to get inspired and write, or do you have an inspiration and you jot down something at different times of day? And then what is your favorite time of day to actually sit down and write?
Morning, but not 6 a.m.
I think this is Christine, and you have to cultivate. For me, I have to cultivate that way of seeing. So that those ideas, and I will jot them down. But then I also have to make myself get my butt in the chair to do the work. So it's a bit of both. Like I can track ideas, and I've been doing that a lot on this trip. Like just talking about ideas, and then I'll write them down in my journal actually, and go back and but when I really start to like work on those and draft those, I'll have to just, you know, arrive in the seat and sit there for however much time is my goal and work on that. You know, so you can't wait. For me, I can't wait for the inspiration, and because sometimes you just it won't arrive as much if I'm not prepared to work on it when it happens. Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Mary, and I use old photos. For instance, I took an old photo of my family taken outside my uncle's house in Kansas City, and I used that to pull myself into a section about my family. I used a photo of my parents' wedding day. I used a photo of my father before he was married, and he's sitting on the hood of an old truck, and a woman who is not my mother is draped across his legs, and on the back of the photo, in my mother's handwriting, it said Hank and Noreen. Well, my father died long ago. My father had died when I found that photo, and I thought, why did she keep this photo, and why did she identify it, and who the heck is Noreen? So those were 3 photos for sure I used. I used a photo of the Missouri River that I keep on my desk because I'm very identified with the Missouri River. So when I would think about, because a lot of the scenes are set on the bluffs or down on the beach, and so I would look at that and try to remember exactly what that felt like. So, but I use photos a lot. It's a great way to sort of pull yourself into a scene, I think.
And for me, I think, the narrative of our experience, right, before, during, and after the deployment, that was the part that, so when I say I didn't know where it ended, those were the things I could plot, right? Those were the things that I knew I could work with. These were the stories that I knew I needed to tell. It just kept getting further into our lives than I expected. But the part that then sitting down to work with those, that's when, similar to what Mary's saying, then the memory of my grandpa was coming in, or, and then I would do the same thing, maybe pull out a picture of him, or be like, oh, I remember that picture of him, and pull it out, and so like Christine said, I think there's a little bit of both, right? But those unexpected connections are, I think, the ones that offer the most insight, right? And add probably the most, like Christine said as well, for both me as the writer and hopefully for the reader, right? They're the things that layer and make deeper meaning. And really that's what the writing process is to me, is a chance to explore, to try to answer a question, to make sense of something, right, that is difficult to explain or understand. And so, yeah, it has to take that time. If it was too simple, like you said, I tell my students all the time, if it's like a movie where it starts and you go, oh, I know how this ends, well, that's not what we're going for. Yeah.
You've alluded to it a bit, but what's the reaction been of your families that have read your work, or especially if they were the ones written about and things?
My family's great about it. 3 of my brothers are writers, and they used to write about and for newspapers, and they wrote a lot about the family, so they have nothing to say to me. Right? They can't. But very, very supportive. If my parents were alive, I think they would have been okay. My mother might have had trouble because she wanted everyone to think we were perfect. She always wanted people to think for a long time. She worried about that. But otherwise, I have had some blowback from people in the community. One wrote this: I grew up in Chamberlain. This book is boring, and she just wrote all those salacious sexual details to sell books. I wish. I wish that had worked. And there aren't a lot of salacious sexual details, but my family would have been fine. Are fine.
I have a lot of different family members that are mentioned in here, and sometimes I ask their opinions about ideas that I'm going to cover, like if it's something like there's a piece on family secrets, and there's one secret that I asked my family if I could share because it wasn't really my secret, it was their secret, and they said yes. And then there's one part of the secret that was mine, I had a version of it even though it was our family secret, and I didn't ask their permission to share it, I just did. So my ex-husband, I did ask his permission in the pieces that have him in it if he minded if I sent them out into the world, and he's like, well, that's not how I would tell the story, but you're a writer, and I respect that. And my son, we're just starting, my older son, we're just kind of starting to talk about his history with epilepsy, and he's pretty comfortable with talking about it. He always wants to be focused on the good things he's done and that what stuff they can be proud of. So I try to always. I think when I originally wrote this essay, he had gone through puberty yet, and his words hadn't come back, and he was struggling a lot more. And so when I revised the essay before I sent it out for publication, like I put that piece in there, because I wanted to show that it was shifting a bit. But yeah, so that's how I kind of. It's different with every piece, I think. And if I write about someone who I think will be bothered by it, I always change their name.
Yeah.
So I could have changed Blake's name, but that wouldn't have done much good, so,
Yeah,
Right.
it's pretty hard to do that in South Dakota.
But,
Change my husband's name.
So the very first piece that I wrote that has become part of this book, I wrote in Christine's class. And it was an essay about the moment when Blake had come home from Iraq on his R&R, rest and recreation. That's a really apt name for it, right? When you get 2 weeks to go home. But he came home to meet his infant son, right? He'd never met before. George was about 2 months old, and then Blake was returning to war. And that was the first moment I wrote about, was being in the airport. And we're sitting there, and Blake's holding our son, and all of a sudden he just went, I gotta go. And he stood up, and he handed George to me, and pretty much took off. And so I'd written about that in order, again, like we were just talking about, to process it, to try to make sense of it, and to think. I knew what was happening because he had explained it to me, right? That you have to flip a switch and say, okay, it's time for me to do this, and stop thinking about your family, right? So I knew intellectually that was happening, but it was very different to see it firsthand, right? So I was writing about it and trying to figure that out. And so when Christine, at the end of the semester, was like, I think this piece is really strong, and I think you should consider sending it out for publication. And I was like, yes, that's what every graduate student wants to hear, until I went, oh, crap. Blake he didn't even know that I was writing about that, right? And so I printed it out in my office, and I went home, and I handed it to him, and I said, I need you to read this. And then I left. Went to Walmart for 3 hours. And when I came home, he said, it's a great story. And he said, that's your story. I'm in it, right? But that's what it felt like to be you in that moment. So it's not really about me or whether that's how I experienced it or not. So I was, astounded, and went, okay, he gets this kind of better than I do, right?
Yeah.
And then, he pretty much just said, keep writing these stories. Well, then when I got to the point where I was writing about his struggle with addiction to pain medicine and the things he had been through, that was kind of another I don't know. And so I said to him, are you sure you're okay with me? Because I had, had a place to publish that online. And I was like, you're sure you're okay with this? And he said, that's when he said, I wish I had read a story like that, to know. And so those difficult conversations that I write about, I just think about, hopefully, if somebody's struggling with that. And I write a lot about that feeling guilty, or feeling like we've messed up, or, failed each other. And that's hard to write about, but I think how beneficial that would be to read that if I had encountered that when we were in that moment, right? And so the vulnerability is difficult. Luckily, he gets it, and he's willing to, allow that vulnerability. But he does tell me he's going to do to me what he did to James Frey, and he's going to expose some big secret. And I'm like, good luck.
That's a really good question, I think. And when you think about it, it's very generous of our family members, right, to let us do that. Or if it's not generosity, it's respect for what we're doing, and they respect it enough to not raise a fuss about it. Really, we're all delving into some pretty personal things, and family fit into it. And for them to all be supportive is actually pretty amazing.
And I have to you almost have to laugh about it, but I also do genuinely. My husband is very introverted and very, and so it really is a strong, I think, respect. And he would say that. I knew I married a writer, so I guess. So it is. It's a challenging thing, but hopefully the vulnerability is worthwhile, right?
When you're in the midst of writing the book, other ideas come to you, and sometimes they're bothersome, and sometimes they'll fit into the book. What do you do with those that don't fit in? Do you think maybe this is something I can do in the future?
Yeah.
How do you record that? What do you do to your writing style or what you're doing right now? How do you put it off?
Stephen King said, sometimes you have to murder your little darlings, by which he meant you may just love that scene you've written,
Mhm.
but it doesn't fit into the story. It may be a great scene, but it doesn't work in this story. So I have a file on my computer called My Murdered Darlings, and I transferred those scenes I had to cut
Yeah?
into that file. So they're still there in case,
Great.
yeah.
Good idea.
This is Christine, I think I do the same thing, a different version, I don't call it that, I call it good tidbits.
Good
but-
tidbits.
But I do the same thing.
Much sweeter.
Yeah.
And I had an experience, this is Amber, in the writing of this book where my publisher told me I had to cut 22,000 words. That's a lot of words, right? And I figured it in my head, it was like the equivalent of cutting an arm and a leg off of this thing I had created. And so I was cutting scenes of my grandma's and like things that it was like, I love this scene, but I can't use it here. And so, yeah, I have a lot of those pieces and essays that I wrote and then, or that I thought were chapters and then they weren't, right? And hopefully they become something else. But one of the great satisfactions was in the final version of the last chapter, one of those scenes that it really broke my heart to cut out came back in. So yeah, you just never know. It found its way back into the manuscript, so. Yeah, you never let go of it.
Can you put together 2 books at one time?
Yes.
You can write 2 books at one time?
Not me, I can barely write one book, so far. Hopefully it'll get easier.
As long, I write predominantly poetry, this is Christine, and I have like 5 books of poetry, and this is my first book of prose. And so it's really helpful for me to ping pong between projects, 2 different kinds of projects, like 2 different genres. Because when I get stuck with one, I can just go to the other and go back and forth. So that usually is pretty good. If I get too many projects at the same time, then I just get overwhelmed, and so I have to really be careful about, prioritizing them. But yeah, it's helpful for me.
Yeah, I think my brain might just work differently because I tried to learn 2 languages at the same time too, and that did not work. So I don't think I can write 2 books at the same time. I can't keep them separate.
Question for Christine.
Yep.
Can you write poetry when requested to do so, probably with a theme? The reason I'm asking, and if Mary Ann eventually watches and listens to this, she'll know I'm talking about her. We had a very dear friend pass away in February. It was a shock. We didn't know, didn't see it coming. And his celebration of life is June 10th. And I've been asked to speak at this funeral. So I'm collecting words from friends. And I contacted Mary Ann and I said, do you think you could write a poem, or is it unfair to commission you to do something like that? Can you do that?
Yeah, I will answer by an example. So in Winnipeg, we had this Rites of Spring where they give you a month in a theme, and you have to write about it, and then they choose 12 to be published in the newspaper. And the theme was joy. And I was like, I'm not writing poetry right now, and I really don't ever write about joy. And then I thought, well, sometimes things are joyful later on in hindsight. So I went through my 5 books of poetry, and every time I found a line that was joyful in hindsight, an image, I wrote it down. And it was like 3 pages, but I got it down to 30 lines because that was the requirement. And it was one of the ones accepted. So so I can trick myself into that. And I think when it's emotional, like the context you described, I think what a lot of writers do will use metaphor, right? So use metaphor, or use a story, or use something that they can tell or draw from that might feel a little bit distant, but still represents their feelings. It's not going to be it's not going to be perfect, but a lot of people want to contribute to something like that because they want to celebrate that life, right? So, I think it'd be fine if people. It's okay to refuse too, right? It's okay to say no, I'm not ready for this, but I think it's a great idea to ask, for sure.
We want to make certain that you know that the books will be at Emka, right? And we'll be leaving some for the center.
We can sell some now and sign them now, but there will also leave them for anyone else anytime.
I wanted to be sure of that.
Yeah.
And I have one last question for Mary. So don't answer the questions if they're in the book. So I wanted to know, did the young woman know that Bev was in love with her? Is that part of the book? Will I answer that? And whatever became of her? And how long did Bev live? Now, that's all in the book. Don't tell me.
Okay.
It's all in the book.
Well, no, it's not.
Um,
No, I will answer one question. The teenage girl, I have talked to her on the phone a few times,
Okay.
and she's doing well. She's living out quite a ways out of state, married, grandmother, and
They were in love.
yeah.
They were in love, right? So she knew.
And it was just, we had such a nice, I wish I could know her, we had such a nice talk. We talked a lot about growing up in a small town. We talked a lot about how naive we were and how little we understood about life, and, you know, we just had a lot in common. So she's doing very well. I'm very happy to report that she's doing well. Yeah, I'll leave the other question.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, guys.
Thank you.